Hi, what's up? Welcome to App Monsters. So today we are going to share a video that was basically demanded from one of our subscribers, Sayed Abdullah Shah. So this is very rare video that you could find on the YouTube that is about the PayPal integration or the PayPal gateway integration in the Flutter. So today we are going to have a very tricky task as well. And I would basically teach you or tell you that how can we do or how can we achieve the PayPal methods within the Flutter app. So first of all, let me tell you that I have simply created two files. One is your main.dot, and in this file, what I've done, I've simply called an object of the make payment class. And when we go to the make payment, you can see that I've created a stateful widget. And along with that, these are the make payment states. And in this, you could only see a text and an elevated button. And the on page is still empty. So let me tell you, let's have a brief introduction first that how we can implement PayPal gateway. For that, what you need is the developer sandbox account for the PayPal. So for that purpose, you can visit the developer account for the PayPal API. There you can create a new account, sign up, and after that, you can create a default app for the testing purpose. So there you can have two options for the sandbox and for the live. Of course, we would prefer the sandbox version just because we are gonna test things, and for testing things, sandbox is obviously preferred because that doesn't contain real transactions, so they are basically dummy. And of course, they would provide you the customer data when you are having a live version. So that is something else. By the way, I would be sharing both of the domains when we are dealing with the WebView. So let me give you some overview. First of all, we would be creating only two files. In one file, we would be creating the backend services, which we would call when you simply click on making the payments for some store. And the other one that would be calling those services or those functions which are basically defined in the backend services. So first of all, we would see that what we have created so far. Here you see that we have a simple title, and along with that we have a button, and when we click on the button we see nothing. So let us create the PayPal services because they would be called in the backend. We would be using some sort of functions in the backend API, just like we would authenticate the client we would authenticate the client using the client ID or the secret key. And after that, we will move towards the transactions. So before the transaction, of course, we need to authenticate. So for that purpose, we would be creating a backend service. So let us create a new file. Let's say I have simply created a new file, and that is, let me give it a name, PayPal services, PayPal services dot. So what we would do over here, I would simply import a package that is for the authentication. Of course, we would be using the HTTP protocols, and along with that, we would be using some some async methods. So of course, we need to import all of those libraries. But before that, I would be simply importing a package that is package, and that is HTTP, and that is dot. So what we need to do, we need to install it because we are going to make HTTP requests. As I said that we are going to use the WebView, as things would be much easier when we are dealing with the WebView because PayPal isn't providing direct access to their services in the Flutter as far as I have investigated. So WebView was very much easy, like we would be scrapping different things from the web browser, and we would be using that in order to authenticate or in order to perform the transactions. So I would be simply importing it as HTTP. So when we go, so of course it is not basically declared or imported in the dependencies. So we would simply be importing this in the dependencies, and for that, of course, I'm using the PubSpec assist, and I would simply tell it that you have to install the HTTP. So here you see that it has simply downloaded and integrated that HTTP into my project. So I would simply do the pubget, and that would tell all of the other files that this file has been added to the dependencies. So after we are done with it, what I'm gonna do over here, I would simply create a class, and I say that this is PayPal services, simple class. So in this class, what we need, of course, we need different things like, first of all, we need to have the domain URL, like the domain we are going to target on. There are, of course, two things. I told you that there is a sandbox version, and along with that, there is a live version. So let's say if I simply create a string domain, this is a string variable, and I simply tell it that what you have to do, you have to follow HTTPS API.sandbox. So this would be basically the URL which we would be targeting when the user in is WebView. So this URL would basically be providing us the authentications, like of course we need to authenticate, you would see, and for that purpose we need the client ID and the secret key. So I'm gonna create two more variables for the string, and that is client ID, and these are empty initially. So I'm gonna create them empty. So that is the secret, and we would place a secret key that would be generated onto the sandbox. So I would be basically giving you some a short view at how you can get the client ID or the secret, but you can easily create on the PayPal developer account for the sandbox mode. So here, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create an async function, and that async function, the return type is string. Of course, what we are gonna take in this function, we are gonna return an access token. So when we do authentications to this sandbox PayPal, the URL over here, or we do authentications with the sandbox, we need to provide it client ID and the secret, and in return, we would get an access token from the JSON generated in the page. Like the page body would be having some sort of JSON string, and or the JSON object or a JSON array, and we would be getting the access token from that, and we would return where we call this event. So for that, let's say if I simply give it a name that you have to access a token, and this is an async function. So I have simply created an async function, and of course I need to return something, but we would do it for sure. So try catch a good example when you need to authenticate, or when you need to do some sort of like very important things, like it can simply generate an error and you can simply fetch that. So I hope that you are all familiar with that try and catch. So for this purpose, in order to get the access token, what we need to do, we need to create another variable. And what we would do the basic authentications of the client. So in order to perform these basic authentications, what we need to do, we need to import another package, and that is, of course, HTTP authentications. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna import another package, and that is HTTP authentications. And of course, it would be providing me the HTTP authentications dot. Fine. So of course, we are missing this, and what we are gonna do, we are gonna come over here to the dependencies, and I'm gonna add HTTP authentications. So that would basically add the HTTP auth, and I would simply do the pub get. So all of the changes in the pub spec appear in the other files as well. So it would basically get, and here you see that we have simply got the method basic authentication client. So this method basically needs two parameters, and that is one, the client ID, and the second one is the secret key which you get from the sandbox account. Fine. So after that, what we would do, we would be having a response, and this response would basically come when we would. So I'm gonna create, and of course, I'm gonna wait for it. And I would basically, after the authentication is performed, we would simply use the post method. And in the post method, what we are gonna do, we are gonna parse a URL. What URL? Of course, the domain. And along with that, the basic authentications or you can say that the client credentials. So you can basically read the documentations and you can get that URL. By the way, I would be using here the different OAuth. Of course, OAuth 2 is basically supported for the PayPal basic client authentication. So we would be using that. So what I'm going to do over here, of course, first of all, there would be the domain, and this would be, let's say, this is domain. And after the domain, what we would do, we would simply complete the URL for the OAuth 2. So we get a response code, or we get some sort of response, and we can get the access token, which is generated onto the web page. So OAuth 2, of course, OAuth 2 would be over here, that is supported by it. And we are going to complete the URL, that is token grant type. Type is, of course, the client, and we are going to give it the client credentials. So this is it. We have done this, but this would, of course, give an error because we are using a string over here, which means that we need to parse it in order to use this URL. So we need to parse into the URI, and then we are all set. So after that, what we are going to do, we are going to check for the condition that if the response dot status code is equal to 200. So 200 status code means that the request was successful and the server has responded with something. So what we would do, we would basically fetch all of the data which is in the response.body. So for that, we would do the convert dot JSON decode. and we would basically convert it. So in order to use the convert, of course, we need to use the convert package for the dot. So for that, what I would be doing that is dot convert, and I would import it as convert. So we can simply decode the JSON that is in the response.body, and this is it. So we have basically got the response, all of the response in the body, and of course that would be having an access token that is basically needed by us. So that is for the authentication purposes. So you should be familiar with parsing the JSON, or you should know that how to deal with the JSON. Of course, that is not part of today's tutorial. So we would return something over here. And after that, what we would do, we need to complete, of course, the trend catch. So this is basically the catch. And we would simply tell it that you need to catch something, and we would simply ask it to rethrow. So this is it. If the request is successful, it would basically give me. So yes, it's mean we need to return something right over here. So we would return some sort of string. Let's say that is string 0 or whatever you want to return. So if the request is good, or the response to get 200 response, so it's mean you have got an access token, and you can simply return where you call this function. So the number one function we have successfully implemented. Another function which we need is to make the payments. So in order to make, or in order to create the payments, we need to create another async function. And of course, we would be mapping over here, and that is a string. We would be returning two set of strings over here. What do we need to return over here? Please be careful that we need to return the execute URL or the approve and the approval URL. So of course, when we do PayPal payments, we do have an execute URL as well as the approval URL. So we need to return both of them after we scrap the links, or we scrap the body of the page that has been returned on the WebView or whatsoever. So we would be basically returning two set of strings. One is the execution URL, and the second one is the approval URL. So for that, of course, we have to map two strings over here. And I'm gonna create a method, and that is basically create PayPal payment. So this is the method. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pass it two parameters, and they are transactions and the access token. Why is that? So of course, I would be passing the transactions. For example, if you are working on, if you are doing online shopping, and you have added something to your cart, then I would basically export these items which you have imported, which you have added to the cart, so it can be viewed by the user when he is doing payment on the PayPal account, or when he is in the WebView and he needs to view that what sort of things he is buying, that what he added in the cart, he can basically see those using these transactions. So it's mean we would be passing the items which the user needs to buy in the transactions, and along with that we would be passing it the access token which we have just returned from the previous function. So that is going to be an async function as well. And this is it. So in this function, what we're gonna do, we are gonna make the payment or create the payment. So of course, we're gonna use these sort of URLs as well. But what is the URL for that? That is, for that, what I'm gonna do, I would basically be using a response, and I would simply post something, or I would generate a request that is http dot post, and the request would be generated on the URL that is domain. And in order to make the payments, we would be following this URL. Like the domain would be, of course, sandbox. This would be sandbox, and we would be using this URL in order to create the payment. So of course, we need to parse it. So that is UI.parse, and here is this is it. So we are all set. After it is done, okay, we do have different parameters for it, but in order to make the payments, this information is not sufficient. What we need to do, we need to pass it the access token as well. So in order to pass it the access token, what we are gonna do, we are gonna use, it is saying that this is undefined, so no problem. Let me define this string. Okay, we would be basically passing it anyways. We can declare it in the in the global scope, and we can basically use this. So that's no problem. Of course, we would be having it. So the scope of this is in this class, and we are creating this method outside of the class. So that's why it is saying that is undefined. So no, it's good. So we're gonna use another other parameters. So other parameters would be, we need to set the headers, like the page we are going to post on, we need to set it headers, and the headers for the PayPal payment page, that requires number one, the content type. So the content type is going to be application or the JSON. Like the content you are going to post is application or JSON. And the second parameter of the property is authorization. So authorization was basically done previously, and a token was generated. So we are gonna tell it that the bearer is plus the access token. So this is it. What we have done, we have basically set its header as well. So we are all set right over here. So when the request is done, it's mean we would get the response. So I would do the same thing as we did previously, that is final body, and it would basically assign again convert dot, we would decode whatsoever is the response. So in this response, we would be telling it that you have to decode the response dot body. So we are all set. Again, what we would say now, we need to check it that if the response dot status code is equal to 201, then we need to check another condition. Now what we are going to do, we need to scrap different URLs from the links, like as you have seen that when we inspect elements of different web pages, you could see that few of the files are basically placed using the link tag, and we need to fetch different things from the links. So of course, for that purpose, what I'm gonna do, I would basically check that if body, and in this body, uh, if you find some links, means if they are not equal to null, and sorry, and body links dot length is greater than 0, it's mean we do have some sort of links over there and we can fetch them. So if the links are available in the response, then what we would do, we would fetch all of the links and we would create a list of those links. So we can check out that which links have the approval URL and which links have the authorization, approval URL, and the second one is the execution URL. So we would basically tell it links are in the body. That's it. So it would basically give all of the links which it has fetched from it, and it would assign it to the list links. Fine. So what we are gonna do over here, we are gonna create two variables. Number one, the execute URL. Of course, we are gonna fetch execution URL and the approval URL. So that is approval URL, and I'm gonna assign it to null string or the empty string. So this is it. Till this. After this, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna iterate through the links and I'm gonna check out what is execution URL and where is the approval URL. So for that purpose, of course, what I need to do, I would be saying that item. So this item would be having the approval URL or the execution URL up to us. So in the item, we would retrieve the approval URL. So we would go to the links dot, like the first where you find, this is the proper syntax. And we would tell it that in the O, if you have REL, if this is equal to approval URL. So if this is equal to the approval URL, then that would assign it the item. It would assign the item what? It would of course assign the item this element, the approval URL element. So otherwise we are gonna say or else what, or else you should, if you find this, sorry, I have mentioned or else outside of that. So if you find this, or else, what should it do? You should assign it null. So that is null. So we are all set for this. And this is it. And I'm going to add a terminator right over here. So what I would say, if item which it has retrieved is not equal to null, then what would it do? It should assign the item to, or the link of the item, or the hyperreference which is in the item to the approval URL. So we would basically assign the hyperreference in that item to the approval URL. So that would be the URL or the hyperreference for the approval URL. So again, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna copy this whole code and I'm gonna paste right over here. And I'm gonna say that this is item 1. And what we are gonna do over here, we are gonna take the execution URL, and for that it simply uses the execute, means the PayPal basically returns execute. We can find this property or this hyperreference using the execute in this links list. So if it finds it, then it should assign this value to the execute URL, and what we're going to show that this is item number 1. So we are all set till now. After all of these things are done, we would simply return. Of course, we need to return 2 strings. Then for that purpose, we're gonna bind it, and I'm gonna say that the execute URL is execute URL, and the approval URL is approval URL. So this is it. It would return it. Otherwise, what I'm gonna do, of course, we haven't used try and catch over here. So otherwise, what it should do, it should throw an exception, and that exception would be like just right over here. I would throw an exception. Throw an exception. Like if something goes wrong, I would simply throw an extension. Of course, we need to complete the else part of it as well. So in order to complete that, if it is not good, means it doesn't return a status code 201, its been links are not obtained, and we would simply throw an exception right over here. And for that, I would simply throw exception, and that is body and whatever the message is within the body. So that would be thrown. This is it. So we have done it, but yes, we have done it so far. It would throw the exceptions as well. And if we are using the try catch, as I told you, that we can simply use the by the way, it was more preferable if we had used try and catch. So I'm gonna wrap it to the try and catch. So let's see. So this is basically the try, and this is the catch. And in the catch, I would be rethrowing. I would be using rethrow. So how you are all familiar with this. So I would simply copy all of this stuff and paste it to the I hope I've done, means I've simply eaten one curly brace. So we are all set. What we have done over here. So what it says that expect to find is yes, we have it's wrong. This is it. So this would be the second method which we have just added in order to create the PayPal payments. And we need to have a third method in order to execute the PayPal payments. So this would, of course, this would create PayPal payment, but we need to execute the created payment. So for that, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create another async function, and that is string. It will return the string, and let's say it is execute payment. Fine. So if this is URL, and what I'm gonna pass it, that is the pair ID, like the ID of the pair who's paying its bill. The URL, I would basically telling you what is the URL, of course, and we need to pass the access token as well, which we return uh, in the first event. So of course, URL would be the URL where we need to post things. And what is that URL? I would be telling you in detail after this. So let's complete these events first. So that is async, and we would be using try and catch, of course, and this is the catch, and I would basically re-throw in here. So this is it. What I'm gonna do in over here, that is var response, same syntax which we have used so far. We would again post something dot http dot post, and we need to mention the URL. Of course, we have passed the URL where we call this execute payment, and in this we need to tell the body. We need to complete the body of that page. That what you need to do, you need to convert and JSON encode the pair ID. Means we need to encode the pair ID which we got when the user logs in to its account. Of course, when we click on the pay with PayPal, after that it would navigate to the account creation or the login page for the PayPal. If the user logs in, it's mean that pair would be paying the bills, and we would be having that pair's ID. So what we need to pass over here, we need to pass the pair ID. So that is having a property pair ID, and we would pass it the pair ID which we just returned from the pair section. So we would again complete its header as well. So in the headers, we would be having the same things which we did in the above function, and that is the content type. The content type would be the application or JSON, and the authorization would be the same we did above. So that is the access token. So we are all set with it. So here this would get completed, and we're gonna add the terminator. So after it is done, what we're gonna do, we're gonna decode the response generated by the server, and that is we need to convert, sorry, body, and we need to convert it to the JSON. We need to convert the JSON decode, or we need to convert the response to our body, like that is returned in the JSON, and we need to decode the JSON in order to use that. So if we go to the response, and if the response dot status code is equal to 200, it means the request was successful. And what we're gonna do, we're gonna return the body ID. So we would basically return whatever ID we get after we do the execution. So what I'm gonna do over here, I'm gonna return uh, just a normal string in order to complete it. Return, let's say I return 0 in it. So we have just completed the backend PayPal services. So after that, what we are gonna do, we are gonna create another dot class, and in that we would be calling all of these services where we need to use them. And along with that, what I would be doing, I would be passing what items you have added into your cart. I would be passing simply a JSON so we can see that how things work over there. So I'm gonna complete this client ID and the secret. So I would basically copy it. But before that, I need to show you something that when it does the authentications, it would generate an error and it doesn't find the related client ID or the secret, or if it doesn't authenticates with them. So before going forward, we're gonna create another file and I'm gonna name it the PayPal uh, payment. Like this would be the class in which we are going to generate the payment. So it's going to be tricky as well, and um, that's it. In this class, what we are going to do, we are going to use a web view. And let me tell you about the web view. Web view would not support would not support less than 19 SDKs. So you need to update your files or your you say the Gradle to support the uh, SDK 19 or above SDKs. So what we are going to do over here, we are going to create a class. So before creating that class, I'm going to import uh, dot code. So I have imported the dot code, and of course we would be importing the material dot because we are going to use some sort of widgets over here. So package, and this is Flutter and material dot. So it was simply imported. So as I told you that we are gonna use the web view, so we need to add the dependencies to the web view, and for that, what we are gonna do, we would be going to the pub spec, and in the pub spec, I would be adding the web view Flutter. So that would be the dependency which we are going to add, web view Flutter, and this is it. So it's mean now I can use it over here. So I'm going to import the package, and that is web view Flutter, and that is web view Flutter dot. This is it. So of course we need to do upcat over here, so the changes appear over here. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create a class, and let's say that is a PayPal payment class, and that would simply extend the stateful widget. Let's say I'm gonna create the stateful widget. I hope that you are already familiar with the stateful widgets. So I can basically use that is stateful widget. So this is it. it has simply created the stateful widget for me. So what I need to do over here, I don't need it, but I would surely need it, because I need to tell it that when it is finished, then what you have to do. So I'm gonna customize these things. So I'm gonna delete this, and at override it's good, but this is it. So what is gonna be the name of this? Name is of course the PayPal payment. And what I'm gonna do over here, this would be, yes, this would basically create the state, but this is not complete. So I'm gonna simply write new for the state creation. So that is going to be, you need to override the state, and that is the stateful widget. And you need to create, create the state. And after you have created the state, what you need to do, you need to return PayPal payment state. So where we did that, that is, it's mean we need to create another class. Let's say that is PayPal payment state. So that would be basically the state of it. That is just below. We need to modify that a little bit. So I'm gonna say that this is PayPal payment state. So here, of course, we need to tell it that where you need to bind it. So that is PayPal payment, that we are that the class we have just created. So that is PayPal payment. So we are all set over here, but I would rather prefer that what is this package? We didn't include it. We simply added a WebView, Flutter, and WebView Flutter dot. So now what we are gonna do over here, I would be basically creating a final function. A final function that would be the on finish. Like when everything gets finished, then what it should be, I would make it required. So that is required, and I'm gonna, sorry, this is required and we don't need it. So what is required? This is of course the required one. So required this dot on finish. So it's been this is required. I need to make it the required just because this is important, because we need to call the on finish. So right over here, what we are gonna do, we would be simply, I hope that you are familiar with the scaffold states as well, so I don't need to repeat them. So what I would do, I would basically create the global key. So global keys are basically the common keys which you can use among your files. So that is, I'm gonna create it the scaffold state, and I'm gonna create a I'm gonna make it a name I'm gonna give it a name that this is the scaffold key, and this is again the global key and scaffold state. This is it. So we have basically created a global key. So what I need to do over here, I need to create three variables. And number one, I would be creating the checkout URL. Like when it simply checkouts, what would be the URL? When it executes, what would be the execution URL? Like the checkout URL we previously did in the services, and the execution URL we previously obtained in the services. So now we are going to assign all of those things over here. So again, of course, the access token which we returned over there from a function. So I'm simply going to press the Control S. So in order to do the changes, after it is done, what we are going to do, we are going to create an object of the PayPal services right over here. Like I'm going to create an object of the PayPal services, and I'm going to give it a name of services, and that is PayPal services object. So it's mean all of those events which were declared in the PayPal services, I can basically use them right over here in this file. Of course, we need to use all of those events. So before going forward, I need to, what I need to do, I need to have a default currency, like the user which is paying, what sort of currency he's using. So we can do that afterwards. But before that, the most important thing is we need to create a constructor, and for that, let's say I say that right as, and in this what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna call all of the methods which I've just created in the PayPal services. So first of all, I would be getting the access token. After that, I would be getting my order parameters, like the transaction variable, which I told you that would be having your transaction details, just like just over here. We had a transactions. So we had transaction, and that's it. So it's mean we would pass it to parameters. So for that, it's mean we need to create the transactions JSON as well. So I would be telling you how to create that. But in the constructor, what we are gonna do, as soon as the user clicks on this pay with PayPal, it would basically call its constructor. And in the constructor, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create a future builder, and that is delayed. I would of course be delaying 0. So I would add its parameter, and that is you should be delaying 0. And you need to call a method which is async. This is it, and that's all. So this is it. In this async method, or the asynchronous method, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add that try and cache, just like we did previously. Sorry, this is try and catch, and I would rethrow. Or we would not rethrow, but I would throw something else just after that. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna I'm gonna call all of these services. So here you see when we call the get access token, we return an access token from that body. So what I'm gonna do over here, I would be using the variable just created in the class that the access token would be having await services, the object of the PayPal backend services dot access get access token. So it would basically get the access token, or it would basically return me something like null, or what things we have written there for the, in order to deal with the, you know, uh, in order to deal with the errors, or dealing with that the server isn't responding, and etc. and etc. So what I would do after the access token has been gained, I would create another final result, and I would say that await and services dot create PayPal payment. Means when the access token has been taken, it's mean we can successfully create the PayPal payments. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pass it the transactions and access token. So I haven't created the transactions as yet. So what sort of transactions it could be? Let me tell you, if you're familiar with the JSON, then I would be simply saying that the transactions over here would be like we need to get the order parameters. So order parameters, I simply copy from a source, and we can simply add it to over there. So I'm basically copying the parameters. Let me tell you what sort of parameters can be in the get order params. That is basically having a list. A list of what? That is basically the list of items, are the total bill, and that's basically in that you know get params. So in order to get order params, we need to have a long list, and I would simply copy that list and paste right over here. So that is uh, let me add that. I have copied the uh, transactions JSON which we need to use right over here. So I would be simply creating another method that is for the get order params, and in the get order params, just after this, I'm gonna create another method in order to get the params. So I could get all of the things which we need in the form of JSON to be posted on the payment page. So I'm gonna bind two returning things, and that is one is dynamic and map, and that is get order params. So let's say if this is the method I'm gonna create. So it's mean we need to return something. So this is something which I copied from a source, and this is. So what is this? Is enable shipping and is enable address. So that is some sort of thing, and this is default currency. It's mean we need to create item name, quantity, item price, default currency, and the is enable shipping and is enable address. So what is it doing? Return URL and the cancel URL. So let us create all of these things in order to complete this get all items. So first of all, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create a string of item name, and let's say if this is iPhone. So in the same way, I'm gonna give the item price. So this is something which was listed on the store, and now you are basically parsing it to the PayPal payment page. That this is the total payment, and you need to return this and this and thing to perform the transaction. So let's say this is the quantity. So in the same way, you can create a JSON, a list of JSON objects, and which could contain the many items, and you can simply pass them to the PayPal payment activity. So let's say the payment is one. Sorry, the payment is only for the quantity number one, and total quantity is of course one. And again, what we need to do, we need to create the default currency. So in order to create for the default currency, what we are gonna do, we are gonna map again. Let's say if I do right over here, let's say that map, and it should return, of course, currency. And let's see if I make it dynamic and dynamic map, and I name it as a default currency, just it has asked. So let's say this is the default currency, and I would assign it. This is assigned as. So what could be in the currency which we need to parse? That is the symbol, of course, symbol, and let's say this is USD, US dollars, and how many decimal digits you want to contain. These are basically all the properties which need to be set in order to pass the payment to the PayPal payment page. So next we need to tell it the symbol before the number, like you want to add the symbol before the number, like the dollar sign. Yes, I need to add the symbol before the number, and that is set to true. And here I'm gonna tell it that the currency is USD. So this is it. We have done the default currency as well. And yes, is enable shipping and is enable address isn't as yet unknown, and return URL and the cancel URL as well. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create a Boolean. Of course, they were Boolean. So they were is enable shipping. And let's say initially I'm gonna set them to false. So let's see what happens right over there. What is that property? Bool is enable address, and let's say I'm gonna set it to false, because these two things were in the if condition, so they are returning either the true or false. So we need to have the return URLs. Basically, it is when the user doesn't complete any transaction or cancels or returns to the main page of the shopping store. For this instance, I would simply say that the return URL is either the return.example .com, like my own application, the store of this, and the cancel URL just listed below, and that is cancel.sample.com. This is it. So we are all set with it. No, what we need to do, we need to get the transactions before we pass it to the create payment, create PayPal payment. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create another final, let's say transactions, and this would be having get order patterns. So basically what it would return this whole term. It is still giving me the error. So they were basically the name, conventions, and that is URL is in capitals. This is it. So till now what we have done, it would simply return the temp, and temp is having all of the properties which need to be set when it navigates to the payment method tab, and this is it. So it's mean that it would show on the top or somewhere where the PayPal payments, if you have ever seen the cart, like the things you are going to purchase, and they would be shown right over there. So just after it has been done, what we are going to do, we are going to check for the result, that if the result is not equal to null, because we know that we are returning some null and all on the create payment, create PayPal payment. So I don't think that this null would be having any, concern over here. So let's see what it does shows. If it is not, yes, it is saying that this operand can be null, so the condition is always true. So simply remove the condition. So by the way, we need to add it. We need to add it. So if the result is not equal to null, so what we are gonna say, we are gonna set the state. Means after the create PayPal payment, we know that we have returned two things, and one is the execution URL and the second one is the approval URL. So what we are gonna do, we are gonna assign these two data members, the execution URL and the checkout URL of what we have returned. So checkout URL would be basically the approval URL, like you are ready to go. So I'm gonna set the state, and in the set state, I'm gonna pass checkout URL, whatever is in the result, and the approval URL like we returned previously. And right over here, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna give execute URL, whatsoever is in the result, execute. I think we paused. Yes, this is execute URL. So whatsoever is in the execute URL. Fine. So if we get some sort of errors like in the cache or in the cache, so we are going to show that into the snack bar. Like you are all familiar with the snack bar that pops out from the below. So we would basically print the exception on the debug console as well. So let's say if this is print, or simply we can print the exception on the debug console if some sort of exception occurs. Moreover, you can basically add a snack bar in order to go back to the application or to go back to the main shopping site if it throws some sort of errors. So that is error.toString. So it would basically return me the error. So we are all set in this class. What we are going to do more is, yes, we need to return something like, of course, we need to return the web view when we are in this activity so we can continue each and everything. So for the web view, we have already imported the web view. And what we are going to do over here, we are going to simply, let's say if I'm going to create an app bar, or it is already returning the container. So let me remove this. So when it is built, or this page is built, I'm going to say that you should print the checkout URL, like what is in the checkout URL, in order to check that what sort of URL we have. So after you printed the checkout URL, so I would basically I would be adding all of these things, or I would be executing payments. So this is basically in order to execute the payments. So when we are going to execute the payment, of course, we are going to execute the payment in the web view. When checkout URL is not equal to null, means that has been returned with something like what we did. We received some checkout URL. If you are ready to go, then we are going to execute the payment. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to check for the condition that if checkout URL is not equal to null, it means user is going to check out its payment and we are ready to execute the payments. Fine. So in this, what I would do, I would basically return the scaffold. I know that scaffold provide me a lot of properties like app bar, home, and all of this stuff. So that's why, of course, the drawer as well. So we would prefer the scaffold. So this is scaffold. And in the scaffold, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add the app bar, of course. And app bar would be app bar. And let's say the background color of this app bar is, sorry, background color of this app bar is, let's say, whatever the background color is of the theme, of the main theme. So for that, I'm going to say that theme dot of context dot background color. So whatever the is of this current activity, you should follow this background. So of course, in the leading, what I'm going to do in the app bar leading, I'm going to add this is leading section. I'm gonna simply add the back iOS button. So back iOS button would be basically be used. I'm basically adding iOS button just to make it better, look. So for that, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create a gesture detector. I hope that you are all familiar with it. And of course, in this child, I'm gonna add an icon, and that would be the icons dot arrow back. That I find arrow back or arrow back iOS, that would be much pretty. So that's it. So what I say that when I click on this gesture detector, it should say that this is on tap. It should basically be having a method, and what would that method be doing? I would basically go back to the previous activity, and that is navigator dot pop the context. So this is it. This is what we have done so far. So I would simply press the Control S, and that would give the changes to it. And let's see if we have not any errors. Yes. So let me delete this statement. This is it. So what it's saying that will, okay. So this is in the scaffold app bar. And after we have added the app bar, what we are gonna do, we are gonna add a body. So in order to add the body, what I'm gonna do over here, I would be loading a web view. And in the web view, now this is kind of very interesting. In the web view, you can see all of the properties, like if you want to enable the debugging, or what would be the initial URL. So initial URL would be equal to checkout URL, the URL which we return over there. So after that, I'm gonna make the JavaScript mode unrestricted, so it doesn't cause any restrictions. And I would basically be saying that you should add, sorry, JavaScript mode, and that is your unrestricted. So it would be unrestricted JavaScript mode. After that, I would be adding the navigation delegate, of course, the most important property. That would basically be the request, and that would be containing the URL where we want to return, or if we want to return to some return URL after the payment is successful, or whatever, we would be basically retrieving all of these parameters. So navigation delegates, that is navigation request, and let's say we give it a name, a request for this object. So this is it. In this, what we are gonna do, we are simply gonna say that if the request dot URL dot contains return URL, like the return URL we provided on the top. Like if the user doesn't want to return, we would be having this feature. You would see if it has, if it contains the return URL, then what you should do, you should we are going to create a final URI, and we would simply parse the request.url, like whatsoever is the URL in the request, we would basically parse it. So that is request.url. And after that, we would be retrieving the pair ID, and that is URI dot query parameters. And we would be basically retrieving this pair ID from URI.query parameters, and that is pair ID. This is it. So we would say that if the pair ID is not equal to null, then what you should do, you should use the services object and call the, means If the pair ID is not equal to null, it means user has successfully logged into the PayPal account, and we would basically call the execute services dot. Why we don't get this execute payment? So in the PayPal services, we do have execute payment. So that is execute payment. And what we need to pass it, we need to pass it the execute URL, the pair ID we just returned, and the access token. After it has been successfully implemented, it says that it is not defined what we did over here. So maybe we didn't press Control S. Let me see why it is showing that sort of error. Yes, it was basically defined outside of the class. So this is it. Outside. So now we see we have execute payment. After it has successfully executed, we would be using then statement, and in the then, I would say that the value is ID, and what you should do, you should be using widget dot on finish and pass with the ID. And after it is done, you should directly navigate to the previous activity, like to the main store activity, and that is navigator dot or, and this is the context. This is it. So here it looks like this. So that would be on finish, would give it the ID, and still we are getting the error in the build, means we are not completed with something as yet. So let us figure out that. Means we need to return something, and or we need to make it more better in order to work. So what we are gonna do next, we are gonna say that if this condition isn't true, then what you should do, if this condition isn't true, means pair ID is equal to null, then what we're gonna do, we're gonna say that go to else and go to the previous activity, means the user is not authenticated yet, or it hasn't, it hasn't passed anything, or it hasn't get authenticated, or hasn't used is on information. So if this is not the case for this if statement, what is it saying? Okay, we will fix it. So if, and after that there is else, and just after the else, what we are going to do, we are going to say that it should again
navigate to the previous activity if something is not right. Again over here, and we would be simply adding another condition, like this was containing the return URL, and we would be comparing another condition that if it contains the cancel URL. Like if it contains the cancel URL, then what should it do? It means it should go to the main store listings. So if it contains cancel URL, so it should go to the main store. This is cancel URL, and in order to go to the main store, what we're gonna do, we're gonna make it this. And after all of this is done, what we're gonna do, we are gonna return navigation decisions dot navigate. So this is it. So here we see no error right over there. So for example, if the checkout URL is equal to null, so it means we need to add an else condition as well. Like in the top, we check that if checkout URL is not equal to null, this means we need to add an else part as well. So for the else part, what we are gonna do, I would be simply returning a scaffold sorry. I would be simply returning a scaffold, and key of that scaffold would of course be the key we created initially, and the app bar would be app bar, and leading would be of course the back button. Leading would be the, let's see, this is icon button, and this icon button is having the icon, and icon is icon dot arrow back. So this is it, the arrow back icon. And for example, I add the on pressed, and so this is icons dot arrow back. And on press, what it should do, it should go to the, it should be having an event, and in this event it should be navigator dot of the same, like we are navigating back. This is it. So we have done this for it, and after we press Control S, we are all set. So you can add for example, if you want to add some sort of circular progress indicator, like you can also add, means when it's loading something, like when it's loading something or it is authenticating. So if you want to show something like the progress circle, you can basically add that. So in order to add that, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add in its body, and in the body section, I'm gonna center a progress indicator. So I'm gonna center a progress indicator, and child is, let's say, a container, and its child is a circular progress indicator. So this is it. So we have done this, and let us now press Control S. And make it working. So before working, what we need to do, of course, we need to, pass people services over client ID and the secret. So for that, I would be using my own client ID and secret. For this purpose, I need to add my own client ID and the secret key. So let me copy that. This is my client ID. Please try to create your own client ID and the secret key so you can run it easily. This is going to be my secret key. You can get these from your sandbox, PayPal sandbox, and there you can locate. So this would of course not work as yet because the problem right over here is we haven't integrated anything with this button as yet. So what we gonna do, we are gonna, of course, we have something like we have a required field on finish over here as well. So what we are gonna do, we are gonna go to the make payment, and upon the button click here, what we need to do, we need to use the navigators like navigator dot of context dot push. So what we are gonna push over here, we are gonna push the material page route. So that is the material page route, material page route. And of course, here we need to give the builder. So we need to give the build context. So that is the build context, and this is the context. And context of this is going to be, we know that we have created a PayPal payment, which would further call the PayPal services. So I would basically go right over here and I would see what is my class, that is PayPal payment. So I would basically call here the PayPal payment, and we have, of course, it's one parameter. You need to pass one parameter on finish, and on finish, I simply say that you need to pass a number, and that is async and what I would do, I would simply print here the order ID. It's mean the order has been completed successfully, so the on finish was called. So order ID, and I would simply paste the number which was returned from over there, and this is the push. So this is all set till over here, but we need to figure out that what is this error about. Like it says that the method PayPal sheet isn't defined for the type PayPal. So that is basically the PayPal payment state. So we are all set. Now let us do the hot restart. So after we do the hot restart, you would see that it would first authenticate me from my services using the client ID. And it has done the restart, yes. I simply, no, it hasn't as yet. So let me do the hot restart again. So let's say if we do the hot reload, and after I click over here, you see that it would start authenticating. And it would show me, it has shown that you have, your authentication is failed due to the invalid authentication credentials. So it's mean that we have missed something, and that could be just because of my authentication. So let me check. So you see that it is basically returning all of things in the results which we have printed. And now here you see that it has been to the PayPal payment login. So here the user can simply put his information. For example, if it simply cancels and return, it is basically returned to the previous page. So we can basically make a new payment again. So here the user would simply log in to his payments, or simply we create an account. And here you see that these are all of the details which are required by the user. Which are required by this system for the user registration. So here you see the items which we passed in the cart previously, that was iPhone, and the subtotal was this, and total was this. So this is what is shown into the example. So I hope that you have enjoyed the video, and you would now be able to integrate the PayPal into your Flutter applications. Please feel free to comment below, and please subscribe my channel. Goodbye.